We're going to continue with this theme of hope and inspiration and calls to action in the next Fireside Chat. I'm really, really excited to invite Andrew Zimmern, a UN World Food Program Goodwill Ambassador, an Emmy-winning and James Beard Award-winning TV personality.
4 times.
He's a...
Don't undersell it.
I mean, I don't have to introduce him. Chef, writer, humanitarian, badass. Bigger round of applause. Bigger round of applause. So, my friend, it's great to see you. It's been a bit.
Great to see you, too.
I know you've been busy, having fun, too.
Favorite week of the year.
It is your favorite week of the year. Well, I want you to sort of give a little snapshot of what it's like to be a Goodwill ambassador.
Well, for someone who's noisy, who is frustrated by the pace of change, the seeming slowness, but it actually comes in very, very large jolts of progress, followed by setbacks because of climate crisis, conflict in different parts of the world, COVID, right? The 3 C's, as my friend David Miliband calls them. It is an opportunity to spread a message that I think everybody needs to hear.
Yeah.
And for those of us in this room, statistically, there, should be quite a few hungry people here who may not know where their next meal is coming from. But given the mix of people that I see, I would imagine this is probably a pretty poor sampling of that. But when you're out in the world as a Goodwill ambassador and traveling, actually going places and talking to people, and Baron made a good point. Ask questions.
Yeah.
Find out what's going on. I mean, if you want to know what farming is like in a different country, go visit a farm and ask a farmer and ask them how they're doing it and making it work. The ability to take those messages and then tell stories about them, whether it's in a setting like this, on television, in my podcast, in my books, and whatever it is that I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm just a storyteller, but I'm a noisy one that, throws a tantrum like a baby and wants to get attention. And so far it's worked.
It is working. But what I like about you, Andrew, and what I've always liked about you is you're a great listener. And that's part of this. You're a good storyteller, but the only way you can do that is by listening to those stories in the field. And I'm wondering if you can share some anecdotes of recent travels.
Sure. A word about listening. I bumped into someone at an event last night and in the afternoon, and they said, "Oh, I'm surprised you're here." And, because it was a very arcane, sort of wonky little panel in a room in a building in Midtown with 50 people.
Yeah.
But the people who were speaking on that panel were the people I wanted to learn from. And they were the viewpoints that I needed to hear from. A minister from Kenya, someone from the World Bank who actually writes the checks, right? One of my heroes who's the head of the Blue Food Assessment at Stanford. And, it's these kinds of weeks that give me the learning, right, when you talk about listening, so that when I'm out in the field, then I can pair numbers and data and wonky talk, which is really necessary, with what I see out in the field or on the water.
Yeah.
Baron did such a great job, giving a top-down overview of everything that we do. When I was last in Zambia, for example, the resiliency programs that I saw that the WFP and their partners had put into play was absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Right? A very small hydrology experiment, data collection point that was downloading thanks to partners, like Google and, the incredible AI that they've developed that allows that predictive forecasting, which means that people can move out of a flood zone. So instead of giving humanitarian relief, right, and having to unload bags of rice and mobilize people and build tents and house folks and all the rest of that, those monies can go in to other programs, right? Like ones that I saw, which absolutely blew my mind, which was a little aggregator program in a town where 100% of the people who live there are smallholder farmers. In Zambia, about 95% of the people in the whole country are smallholder farmers. And what this aggregator program did is it actually took advantage of the other resiliency programs that the WFP put in place. So things like crop diversity, things like bags that are pest resistant and water resistant, yet they still breathe, right? So that they can save more food. And equipment, as well as education about farming that would allow these farmers to take advantage of these changing conditions, right? So these incredible farmers in this small village are seeing about a 15%, 20% increase in their yield. That's massive. But they're in a tiny village hundreds of miles away from the nearest city. So an extra 25, 30 pounds of beans, by the way, they are growing crops to sustain themselves. There's nothing for them to do with the extra 20 pounds of beans they have now. So the WFP establishes an aggregator program. They literally put this sack of beans on a bicycle that was broken, but they used it kind of like a dolly. And the farmer and her husband literally hold on to this bike, took the 20 pounds of beans, gave it to the aggregator. The aggregator weighs it. By the way, the aggregator is just a guy in a cement room, but that cement room is pest proof and waterproof, right? So they have this extra 20 pounds of beans. He buys it from them and gives them cash on the spot. That $20, $30, $40 that they get is the difference between surviving and thriving for that family. That means clothes, pots and pans. I'm talking about the simplest things that they wouldn't be able to purchase without the extra dollars. The aggregator waits for his room to fill up with sacks of beans. He calls his buddy in Lusaka and says, Bobby, come on down with the truck. He comes down with the truck. He's taking 15,000 pounds of beans back to Lusaka to sell it where people actually are buying the beans. So it's creating these systems that are so important. That little hydrology experiment, sure, it tells them how much water is falling, where it's falling, what the evaporation rates are, all that other kind of stuff. But it's data that can then go to banks in Lusaka or banks in NGO Bank, World Bank, etc., and provides the valuable thing that is required, which is information, which is what's required for these lenders to give money. So it's the way, there's a holistic system that allows us to actually make a real difference, not in the lives of one person here, one person there, which is very important, but to transform, as Barron said, villages. So, I don't know how to save the world, but I know how to save my next door neighbor from hunger. I can just bring food to him. So once I've done that, then I can do it in my community. Then I can do it in my city. Then I can do it in my state. Then that work can then be spread out.
Yeah.
It can be used as test data.
Yep.
We can tell people what works. Then I'm saving my country. And maybe some of those things can go out and save the world. It's very, very important. The other thing that I think is really valuable is that, I specialize in ocean work when I'm away from the WFP. But the WFP is not just doing terrestrial-based programming, right? And staying with Africa for a second, it's a massive island, right? And they're having a water crisis different than the one that's happening from drought, but what's happening on the coast with climate crisis, the little fish that people would take small little boats that, fit two people, maybe it's even a little canoe, a small little rowboat, and they would go out a half mile and be able to throw a net, bring a couple kilos of fish in, keep a kilo for themselves, trade or sell a kilo at the local market. They have no electricity to store it. They have no way to ice it. They have no way to preserve it. So even if they pull a net in and they have some, 20 kilos, they let it go because they have no way to process it or hold it. Now those fish are moving further out. So now fishing is more dangerous because a storm pops up. Instead of taking 2 hours to come back to dock, it's 8 hours to come back to dock. In some cases, some storms, that's a literal life or death situation.
Absolutely.
So supplying those fishermen with bigger nets, a bigger boat, a 20-pound Johnson outboard, right? a couple of $1,000s worth of equipment can be transformative for an entire village and a family. Then collecting the data from what's going on there in terms of what the sales are allows banks to lend the money to grow that system. So these kind of things are really, really, really important. When you're investing in the WFP, you're not just giving money for meals, you're transforming lives and infrastructure around the world.
Well, Andrew, especially with blue food systems, what you're describing also creates this sense of entrepreneurism because the lack of processing you mentioned now can be managed in a way. There can be those small businesses that are drying fish or canneries, those kinds of things.
You make a brilliant point, and I'll expand that. One level, we actually talked about this at South by Southwest one year. I give a stump speech where I talk about this Mobius strip. Right? And food, right, is a very, very important pillar of that, but it's actually broken down into a lot of pieces, right? So, there's hunger and there's waste, and then there's climate crisis, and there's immigration, and there's national security, there's international security, there's immigration, there's health and wellness. What are you eating, right? We keep going around in this strip. You pop in there on any one of those issues, and you will bump into those other issues. It's an ecosystem of change that we have to be aware of. So it's one thing to, fund people going after, this fish over here that maybe is a good source of protein. Everyone talks about protein. But in Bangladesh, where they've devastated the coastline with a lot of bad practices in the shrimp business, that we now are transforming them with good practices in the shrimp business, right? So we're not polluting the water, we're not using a lot of chemicals, on and on and on. But what they're finding is with very small investments, people are growing crab hatcheries in their homes that's now going out to the coast, and Bangladesh is now taking advantage of the 74% of the global seafood trade that happens in Asia. Okay, only 4% happens in Africa, because of all the problems I told you about. 4%. Africa's the largest island in the world. I love calling it a large island, right? It should have a massive percentage of the international seafood trade, but it doesn't because of infrastructure. We need infrastructure in Africa. We need a full electrical grid. We need them to be able to have what they need on the coasts to store and process seafood. Well, what they found in Bangladesh, which is fascinating, is there's this tiny little fish, very little known, and Americans, we don't eat little fish with the heads on it, but the rest of the world does, just like goat, which is a much better meat to eat. And this tiny little fish provides 74% of your daily dose of calcium. Now, there's no other fish on planet Earth that even approaches that number, right? So by harvesting those fish, it also supplies a lot of vitamin D, a lot of other things that are naturally occurring in this fish, not just protein, a lot of other micronutrients. That we can focus on that on a trade and actually lift up Bangladesh. If that fish is in greater populations right now around Bangladesh, and if partners like Google AI and monies that are given and all can allow us then to focus on what should be fished, there is demand then somewhere else in the world for it. It's not just about feeding the Bangladeshis, very important. But if we can boost their economy by giving Bangladesh a trade, another leg up on the international economic ladder, that is a vital, permanent achievement that in some cases can lift an entire country out of poverty. Those are the kind of big moves that I really love telling stories about. I think and look, it's happening right here in America. In Hope in the Water, the documentary series I just made for PBS, the Minnesota dairy industry is collapsing, right? We're a dairy state, but it's collapsing in the sense that it's going into the hands of the few, right, with big conglomerates, right, and big co-ops coming in. Small dairy farmers are not able to make it. They're barely breaking even, in some cases breaking even or losing money. Some of those dairy farmers decided to do something pretty radical, especially in a state like Minnesota. It's cold there in the winter, and they started growing shrimp and raising broodstock as well as shrimp for human consumption, right? Broodstock are meant to grow other little shrimp. When we are able to support a program like that as well, that's a jobs program for a state. The same sort of theories and the same sort of business practices can be used for terrestrial aquaculture in all other states, allowing Americans to get fed. Remember, 20% of Americans don't know where their next meal is coming from. And by the way, that number may be shallow because no one likes to jump up and down and say, I'm hungry, I can't afford to feed my family. But when you ask a dad or a mom, hey, do you eat 3 meals a day? And they're like, no. And you say, well, oh, I don't like to eat breakfast. You know, I call bullshit on that, right?
Yeah.
They'd rather have a cup of coffee and wait till lunch and feed their kids, right? I've seen it. And same with dinner or buying medicine for grandma. There are holistic solutions that have implications for solving a multitude of problems, which is why it's so important to have public-private partnerships and to be working with a myriad of entities where you have smart people in the room, because there are phases of solutions that really great groups have no answer for until someone comes in and says, hey, I run a tech firm. We have an AI predictive solution for weather that may be able to tell you when there's fish going to be available or when people should not go out in the ocean, right? Keeping people alive. This is a very fragile ecosystem of change and solution building for which I am very optimistic. I don't know if that sign is still up. So while I'm angry and I'm shouty and I'm frustrated, finally, this year, I'm hearing for the first time that no one wants to get to that. We're in crisis.
Right.
We're trying to avoid Armageddon when it comes to our food system. Our food system internationally, all over the world, in a sense, is very, very broken. But there are so many people committed to remake it, and there is actual change in what I'm hearing. I am not hearing this week, as I've been to panel after panel after panel, or private conversation after private conversation, I am not hearing desperation. What I'm hearing is, hey, I have a solution for this. We have a solution for that. It is now incumbent upon us to put those solutions into practice. We have the skill. Do we have the will? Barron, one of my personal heroes, I listen to everything you say all the time and I memorize it. Talked about, well, you asked for it, you got it. He had a very, very important word that he used, and that's called policy. At the end of the day, this has to change policy, not only at the governmental level, community, state, federal here in America, but also policy at the largest NGOs and largest corporations, right? They all have policies as well. And that's a very, very important part of this puzzle, is finding out from our corporate partners, what does it take to trip the trigger that releases the dollars? It's important to create policy change in the state houses around this country, but also on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., that allows us to increase the monies that we're given. I had a conversation with the ambassador of Zambia that was really, really fascinating when I was over there last. I think they get like $470 million a year, give or take, from the United States government, right? The majority of which is earmarked for medicine, because it's a 20-year-old policy that, was very necessary at the turn of the last century, right? What we've done in Zambia, thanks to American dollars, truly thanks to American dollars, is the average age of a Zambian or life expectancy has now gone from about 44 to almost 70. It's in the high 60s, right? That's incredible. What an amazing achievement. And as the ambassador whispered to me privately, and I think Mike would be okay, the ambassador would be okay with me sharing this, he whispered to me, our problem is now Zambians are living longer, so they're going to wind up dying of starvation instead of another illness. And so that is a crucial, crucial thing, is to get more monies. He said, we've solved the health wellness problem to a great degree. We even have diabetes awareness, classes for people here. It's an ongoing issue, is processed foods have now entered the Zambian diet. But the really, really important thing here is he can't get that $476 million or so is earmarked specifically for certain programs. So what he's trying to do is just, hey, I'm okay with $466 million. Give me the leeway to take some of that money and put it towards these incredible programs that the WFP is doing, right? These resiliency programs that are different than humanitarian, right? Humanitarian relief goes to people in crisis and emergency. Resiliency programs like putting in hydroponic garden beds in schools and letting kids learn about how to teach their parents about a better way to farm, introduce crop diversity into the system, feed them green leafy vegetables at school so they're getting their nutrition. Those resiliency programs that I saw over there, they work. So now we need to expand it to all the other schools in Zambia. If Zambia is food secure before its drought situation, Zambia, which is the size of Germany, Zambia could return to be the breadbasket for that group of countries. I think it's 8 or 9 of them clustered around it, 2 or 3 of which are not doing so hot and are fostering a lot of international security issues and big security issues and border issues for that part of Central, Southern Africa. So by growing food systems holistically in Zambia, not only does it feed them, not only is it good business, not only does it do all those things that we would want them to do, but it becomes an international security issue. Check the box, now resolved. Because when Zambia is a food trade partner with those other countries, guess what? Stabilization comes there.
Absolutely.
And it's very, very important.
Yeah. So in the final sort of minute we have left, you mentioned this idea of thrive.
It's a minute and 53 seconds.
Well, I know how you are, so I gotcha.
By the way, I am going to take a second of that time and just say thank you for doing. We've known each other for a long time, but there is what you've done with Food Tank and the access that it gives to so many different people in this space to tell their stories is so important. You are amazing. Go on.
Thank you.
Don't applaud. You're cutting into my time.
Okay, so thriving versus surviving. What is your call to action to policymakers, to the private sector, to all of us in this room as we go beyond Climate Week? Because we can't just be having people survive in the world; they need to thrive.
Yeah, it's focusing on systemic change and partnerships, right? I mean, we have learned now in 2024, over the last 10 years, it's not just policy change. It's not just going to our corporate partners and getting money from their foundations. It's not just working with the World Bank. It's not just working with the experts on the ground. It is actually creating a system where those people are talking regularly, so the dollars that we spend are actually not being wasted, that are targeted towards longer-term solutions that are resilient-oriented. We can give someone a fish. Absolutely. And humanitarian work is vital. But we have the technology and the money to actually put in resiliency programs so those people can get the fish themselves. And that, I think, is the transformative place that we're at now, and why I'm very optimistic, because people are talking together. I will leave on this one thought. For a long time, these global issues of hunger were a global embarrassment, right? And for many of us a decade ago, we called it criminal. And I actually believe it's a genocidal practice not to solve the problem. And I know that's a really scary big word. However, if there was a place in the world that we could isolate where someone was preventing the solution from solving the problems for hunger, for a roof over people's heads, for just a chance, just the basic human rights, and they had the money and the systems to actually achieve it, and it was percentage-wise disproportionately affecting, in a bad way, women, children, and people of color, we would call that by definition a genocidal practice. Yeah. So we have even in this country, we have the money. Think of the hunger issue in this country. Only 9 states in this country will feed children for free at schools. Only 9. It used to be 10, but Nevada voted to not feed kids. Who's not for feeding kids, right? So the idea is, The idea is this is a very serious global problem for which we have the solution. So if we're not harnessing the power of change and pushing towards that and using our votes, right, and our voices together, then we are not being good global citizens. So I'd implore you all to go out and be good global citizens.
Round of applause for Andrew, please. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.